War. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Say it again. War. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. So, let's discuss the game theory that underpins nuclear deterrence. Theory that's been relevant for millennia since Sun Tzu pioneered death ground tactics, to the Cold War and Dr. Strangelove, to Batman fighting Bane, to you studying for your exams. By the end of this video, I will convince you that the only effective deterrent is a Doomsday machine, and how you always use one when you study.
But this is absolute madness, Ambassador. Why should you build such a thing?
But first, here's a crash course of game theory. And in a YouTube first, beyond just Prisoner's Dilemma. Look at us blazing new trails.
Look at us. Look at us. Huh? Who would have thought? Not me.
Oftentimes, games are not simultaneous one-shot games the way Prisoner's Dilemma is. They can be sequential and they can be repeated as well. I'll begin by using a simple market example to introduce both ideas of credibility and sequential games to get us thinking about the importance of credibility in warfare. We'll first dip our toes into the water with some white-collar warfare. Let's say you're a defense contractor and you're charging stupidly high prices to launch some sweet rockets and satellites for the US military. Just for funsies, I promise this isn't relevant, we'll assume you're also partial to people dying in your cylindrical metal coffins that can fly. And maybe you're also in bed with every president ever. I'm plucking a name out of thin air here, so I don't know, we'll just call you Boeing. Then this newcomer, Elon Musk, comes in here swinging his muscular SpaceX booster shaft around and wants to enter the market because he can make rockets on the cheap. Notice there's an order of decision making here. There's not much you can or really need to do until the Musk man decides whether or not to enter the market. Then you can decide whether or not to fight his entry. This is a sequential game that models reality better than the simultaneous games you may have seen littering the YouTube landscape. First, Muskman decides if he wants to enter the market or not. Choosing not to enter on his part is quite trivial. The status quo is maintained and you continue to make profits of 5 units. The units or their magnitudes don't particularly matter here. The only thing we care about is the order of preferences. So if he chooses to spread the market wide open and enter with his muscular SpaceX shaft, then you as the incumbent defense contractor will face increased competition and lower profits than before. You now have 2 options, fight or let the entry happen. If you just bend over the market and take it, these are the payoffs. For simplicity, we're going to assume that you make the same profits as each other. Or you can choose to fight back and make him unprofitable and eventually crash out. As you can see, this is very costly for you, but you can operate in the market, whereas Muskman can't. His big SpaceX shaft can't sustain negative profits and fails to establish itself in the market. Instead of the Nash equilibria we get from a payoff matrix, we are now dealing with subgame perfect equilibria here. We use backward induction to find our equilibrium. Boeing is best off under no entry. But if Muskman enters, Boeing is better off not fighting, as Boeing will still be profitable. Knowing these end payoffs and what Boeing's best responses are to each of his choices, Muskman makes his choice. Enter. Assuming perfect rationality, ceteris paribus, Boeing will never fight this entry, and Muskman knows this. And there we have it. That's our subgame perfect equilibrium at enter, not fight. But here's an idea. What if you didn't actually have to fight Muskman, but merely threaten to fight him? This way, you could actually end up moving the subgame perfect equilibrium off the entry branch and into the don't enter branch for Muskman, where you are unambiguously better off. Question is, would he believe your teeny tiny Boeing-sized shaft is bigger than his muscular SpaceX shaft? Still talking about rocketry here, guys. Like any rational actor, Muskman would never enter the market if he knew he'd make negative profits or a negative payoff from a market war with you. But your threat to fight him would have to be credible, otherwise he would not believe it. So you open a few extra factories, flex some spare capacity, and multiply your lobbying capability to make sure SpaceX doesn't succeed. In more traditional markets as we know them, you might expect strategies like dumping, which is anti-competitive. However, in a market for rockets and satellites for governments, this kind of strategy is not really feasible. So you do what you can, which also involves you visiting the Oval Office with a briefcase full of cash, and you leave with just a smile and the American dream. Costly? Sure. But cheaper than actually fighting or competing with new entrants. So even if your payoff from the don't enter branch of the game falls, it's still greater than the old sub-game perfect equilibrium. Again, only order of preferences matter. So this ranks higher than if you don't fight and you don't make a credible threat. If your threat is credible enough, enter, not fight is no longer the sub-game perfect equilibrium, and it actually now becomes not enter, fight, or not fight. Again, sequential game, doesn't really matter. The point is, Muskman does not enter. And this is the key idea. Musk now realizes you're serious about fighting him off and is less likely to enter. To his mind, the fact that you're willing to take some losses to prepare for a fight makes the enter-fight equilibrium the much more likely possibility, where he loses out. So, congrats! You're once again safe to cut corners on your processes for another day. Good job, everyone! Bonuses all around. Bonuses all around. This is something that actually happens very frequently in the tech industry, where newcomers are either absorbed by big tech, or, if that fails, they simply copy everything new companies do. Through years of this practice, threat of copying is now a credible equilibrium to new entrants. Compare it with a less realistic, simultaneous one-shot game with more than one pure strategy Nash equilibrium, and you see how things differ. As you can see, the don't enter fight outcome, which makes no sense, becomes a feasible outcome, and I actually have to make the payoffs make sense. Boeing only responds to Musk if he actually tries to enter. They don't have to react at the instant Muskman makes his choice without knowing what he decided. So, just as here, thinking sequentially is often a more realistic model of the real world. Now that we've established the idea of credible threats and sequential games, let's jaunt over to nuclear Armageddon.
Deterrence is the art of producing in the mind of the enemy the fear to attack.
Picture this. You're the UK Prime Minister and you've got your nuclear deterrent, Trident. The idea of nuclear deterrence is grounded in mutually assured destruction, MAD. If you are ever attacked, at least as a last resort, you will obliterate your enemy, which in turn makes them obliterate you with nukes too. In this war game, which is a spin-off from the OG Prisoner's Dilemma game, the payoffs from both countries maintaining peace together are always higher than both countries warring. But typically, as is the case with Prisoner's Dilemma games, the equilibria from both the simultaneous and the sequential games will be war. Again, the simultaneous game doesn't really make sense. When one nation attacks another, the other isn't instantaneously ready with nukes or a white flag when the first country declares war. Let's look at the sequential game decisions and payoffs. If the first country prefers peace, they won't be ready for war and will be dominated when the second player makes their choice. Under perfect rationality, the second player will look to improve their welfare and go to war. If the first country declares war, the perfectly rational responding country is actually indifferent and will randomize their choices. Under indifference, the weighted average payoff down this branch is higher than the peace branch for the first decision maker, 3.5 versus 0. If, however, the second player is spiteful, they will always retaliate in kind with war. So, whilst under these conditions, both countries going to war is not the guaranteed outcome, we are certain country 1 will always declare war. Notice that this action by the first player locks out the second player from making any utility. They will now always have a utility of 0 no matter what they do. So, nobody would be mad enough to attack you thanks to your nukes, right? Wrong. Think about the fallout of using nukes of that scale. Incalculable loss of life and infrastructure now and for decades to come. Suddenly, instead of no payoff from war, you're actually looking at negative payoff for everyone. Hugely negative. Even better than, right? Now they will definitely, absolutely not attack. Right? Wrong. Now they will definitely attack because you're better off being occupied or losing a war than madly committing to mad. Alright, I'll stop. This is now a game of chicken. You'd prefer to yield and lose the war than commit to a total nuclear apocalypse. No matter how bad losing and being occupied is, it is not worse than ending. Again, I know I changed the magnitudes, but the magnitudes themselves don't matter. I made the payoffs hugely negative just so we would be certain that total war, total nuclear apocalypse is always worse than being occupied. And that's the idea, right? The ordinal preferences. Let's break this game down. As the second player, who is perfectly rational, you'd again prefer the top branch. If player 1 goes peace, you'll always war, because this improves your welfare. Player 1 recognizes this and sees their utility will always be 0 if they choose peace. Looking at the bottom branch, the payoff is higher at peace than at war when the first country is the aggressor. This is because nuclear annihilation, as you might expect, is the absolute worst. You will never choose such a terrible outcome, would you? Country 1 realizes this and so chooses to always declare war. Therefore, the subgame perfect equilibrium outcome is war-peace with payoffs 7-0. As you might have already noticed as well, with sequential games comes possible first mover advantage. That holds up here, and it seems pretty realistic as he who strikes first wins, or at least has an advantage. The first mover advantage implies something sinister about the idea of nuclear deterrence. Not only does it not deter, it can become a catalyst for war. Both countries understand the first mover advantage and actually scramble to be the first to declare war. At its worst, two nuclear powers can butt heads and keep driving straight towards each other until it is too late, as was nearly the case during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is known as brinksmanship. In our timeline, both ended up swerving by agreeing a tit-for-tat removal of missiles from Turkey and Cuba. But total war is not the only option. Your enemies can make certain that your payoff from nuking is much, much lower than doing nothing through salami tactics.
Salami tactics.
Slice by slice. One small piece at a time.
The threat of nuclear war is just not credible enough from you, Mr. or Madam Prime Minister. You have so many other options that are so much less costly for your homelands that your enemies recognize you would never use nukes, especially against minor aggressions. In fact, neither would they. Instead of total war, they commit to minor infringements such that inaction is always your dominant strategy. Look back at World War II. First, it was allowing the rebuilding of the Navy, then Anschluss, then the Munich Pact, and only after that, Danziger War. Here are some more modern examples. Would you use nukes if Iran captures your ships? What if it was to protect Ukraine, an EU applicant and NATO hopeful, from the Russian annexation of Crimea? What if a NATO member state gets invaded? You see, the cost of actually using this deterrent is so colossal, you probably wouldn't actually use it. After all, how could you justify nuking a country simply because of some minor aggressions? You would literally be responsible for ending the world. Would your allies even stand with you in the last hour of our lives? Even the most hawkish of you would at least hesitate before damning the Earth to the cataclysmic destruction of thermonuclear warfare. Thanks to Salami tactics, even if your perceived payoff from nuclear warfare is not as low as I made it out to be, the cost of doing nothing is now so small you would just prefer to take the peace option. Your enemies, much like Muskman, can and will bend you over the borders. But fear not, my Prime Minister, this is where the magic of the Doomsday machine comes in.
It is not a thing a sane man would do. The Doomsday machine is designed to trigger itself automatically.
An utterly credible threat that is set to trigger automatically under very specific conditions. On its own, able to annihilate the world. Attempts to disarm it will trigger it, and it is impossible to untrigger, defuse, or deactivate it. There is no prospect of human hesitation or human mercy. To achieve a similar thing now would be akin to dismantling your navy, the air force, the standing army, the intelligence services, bomb shelters, and everything else not required to maintain Trident. If you have no option but to use the nukes, the threat becomes much more credible and believable. But again, it is rare to find a human hawkish enough to condemn the world to a nuclear death. After all, it is not a thing a sane man would do. And we would never elect insane people to be our officials, would we? Someone may still call our bluff. And if you are bluffing, you'll now roll over and die much more easily. You have no other defense. The Doomsday machine failed in Dr. Strangelove because the Soviets did not inform the world they had built it. But this is crucial in ensuring the salience of the deterrent is understood by other countries. If, as the CEO of Boeing, you made preparations for a fight in stealth without letting Muskman find out, there's no point. He will not update his expectations for the likelihood of a fight with you if he enters the market. Sun Tzu's death ground strategy was all about this idea. Leave an army no other choice but to fight, and they will fight ferociously because it is the only way to survive. Getting your army purposefully encircled and entrapped can achieve this. Leaving your revision to the last minute makes you study viciously the day before your exam because the exam is an automatic trigger. It will take place at a set time and date, no matter what. You have no other choice but to study hard now or fail tomorrow. The threat of failing becomes so salient that you will study your butt off in the home stretch. Or if you're Batman and you find an exit plan to get citizens out of Gotham in case you fail to stop Bane, you now are more comfortable with failure than had you not had a contingency plan. If there was no exit from Gotham at all, the negative impact of your failure is much more salient and you are that much more desperate to succeed. We've come to the end of another beautiful journey on this channel. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment and subscribe, hit the bell button, call your family and friends, check in on them, make sure they're okay, and just show love all around. Please, show some love, man. I'm still trying new things with these videos, so your feedback in the comments is always appreciated. And while you wait for the chef to serve up the next one, why don't you check out the first video on log functions and the current pandemic? Thank you for watching, and stay safe out there.